Hello, welcome to On Air. We're so grateful to be gathering today to talk about unity and divinity, finding God in one another. We're grateful to Sacred Stories Media for hosting us here on air, and we're so grateful to these three esteemed teachers who are just tremendous. This is going to be an amazing conversation. We have teachers that are deeply steeped in their tradition, but also, and I'll borrow a phrase from Will Keepin, one of our guests here, who describes it as the devotional abandon of the heart. So we have amazing conversation to have today. We have much to learn from these three sages, almost too much to take, but I trust that we can all open our hearts, open our minds, and be ready to hear what they have to say to us and what we can bring out that is new together. These three traverse the mysteries of the universe as agile as a cat. They've been doing this for many years. In fact, in my little bit of looking at their biographies, I can say that their wisdom collectively here is informed by over 100 years of meditation practice. Combined, that is. Nobody here is over 100, but this is amazing. This is incredibly rich. We also have people with higher degrees in psychology, mathematics, physics, English education. We have members of the priesthood, partnerhood, parenthood, grandparenthood, activism, over 20 books between them. And it's just, I combine this biography for you because, I don't want to take the time to dig into each, but we do have their websites listed where you can click through and learn more about them individually. But really what I just want to say is, what I'd love to introducing each of you is to get right into how it all began for each of you. We'll start, I'll just give a brief introduction to Ellen Grace O'Brien, who is an award-winning poet with a beautiful new book of poetry just out now, the title of which is The Moon Reminded Me. But she's also very well known for over 30 years of leadership in the tradition of Kriya Yoga. She's the spiritual director of the Center for Spiritual Enlightenment in San Jose, she's part of her direct lineage of Yogananda, whose book, Autobiography of a Yogi, really introduced yoga to the West in the mid-20th century. Wonderful to have Ellen here. We also have Seán ÓLaoire, who is also the leader of a spiritual community in California. His group is called the Companions on the Journey, and they're described as an independent Eucharistic community devoted to aligning with God and healing separation. He's ordained in the Roman Catholic tradition, but he encourages his companions to develop their own cosmologies, and he rejects all vestiges of hierarchy in his community. His Eucharistic Prayer of the Cosmos is an amazing read. I suggest to you all, again, checking out the websites, you'll learn more about these amazing people. And we also have Will Keepin here piping in from South Africa, where he is right now. He has also just released an amazing new book called Belonging to God, Spirituality, Science, and a Universal Path of Divine Love. Will is trained in mathematics and physics, but he's also a theologian, although he doesn't claim to be. He produced amazing works teaching about the world's religions and the connections between. Again, part of his activism, he runs the Satayana Institute with his wonderful wife, Cynthia Bricks, and they also do gender reconciliation all around the globe, which is what places him in South Africa today. So welcome, everyone. I'd love to start with just a great hello and a welcome, but also my first question pertains to each of you sharing kind of your earliest memory, your earliest recollection of where your spiritual awakening began in relation to your current path. So if I may start with Ellen, please, Ellen Grace O'Brien, welcome.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you for convening this wonderful meeting. It's an honor to share this with you and with my colleagues and all of your listeners. You've asked the biggest question, how did we come to the path? And so I'll try to be concise and say, I can remember being a meditative child, who would, go to my room and just sit. And, I had this great spiritual yearning, even as a child, but I wasn't raised in a family that could really nurture that. So, what proceeded then was a long journey in life of, finding where that spiritual heart was within me. And I came to a place as a young adult of, I would say, having everything that I thought was going to make me happy. And yet there was something missing. I felt there was something missing. And of course, what was missing was me. And I was actually not missing, but my ability to connect with my essential self was missing. I didn't have that. I didn't know. I had heard the kingdom of God is within you, but I didn't have the key to the door to get in. And so when I met my guru, my teacher, Roy Eugene Davis, and I found this path of Kriya Yoga, for me, that was the key. In other words, it was what allowed me to experience the divine nature within me, and of course then within everyone else. So that's the brief history of it, was losing myself, finding myself, finding God in everyone, and here I am.
Beautiful. Well, that's why I asked. I knew that that we share a lot in common. So let's ask Will to chime in with his earliest recollection of where his journey began.
Earliest recollection. Well, sometimes I say that I had a musical revelation, because when I was a very young boy, probably about 3 or 4 years old, I heard particularly the music of Mozart and some of the other classical composers, but particularly Mozart. And through that, I had what I would call a kind of revelatory opening to some kind of higher level of harmony and beauty and perfection and kind of cosmic dalliance, if you will, which stayed with me and enchanted my heart. And I knew then, as I looked around in the world, I knew there was another reality and another realm of joyful, kind of lighthearted, but also kind of full expression of our majesty. And I didn't have the words for it, but I felt it streaming through me very strongly. So sometimes I point to that as my earliest experience. But in terms of kind of getting serious about the path, I would say that the key moment for me was when I actually finished my PhD, and I went to my dream job, working at an institute in Europe that was applying science to solve the problems of humanity. And they had 2 major programs. One was food for the world, and the other one was energy for the world. And to make a long story short, I encountered some data manipulation and essentially corruption, pushing a particular political agenda for nuclear power, in that case, and fossil fuels. And it was all couched in scientific clothing to make it look objective and credible and to give it power in the world and the institutions of the world. And so I had a real crisis of faith at that time. Because I had, studied all those years and I had put all that work, and now I was at this institute, and it was essentially betraying the very foundational principles of that whole discipline. And in somewhat of desperation, I started practicing Zen. I was reading Emerson. I had been reading Krishnamurti quite intensely at that point for about a year or two. Just curious and very interested in Krishnamurti, but then I started practicing Zen meditation, and that was really the beginning for me. And Zen led to Vipassana, and it kind of went from there. But I would say I was led by a real crisis of faith in my life that took me to the edge, if you will, and out of a deep need, I began serious inner inquiry. And then that led to a whole series of mystical experiences in my early 30s that were quite unexpected and really opened me quite beyond the normal understanding of a scientific worldview. And so I began this quest then to try to integrate my spiritual life with my scientific training, and that has been a lifelong quest.
Wow. I'm glad I asked you, because your book sure reflects that, and your work really reflects that. Wonderful. And Seán, I'd love to hear from you too.
So the earliest influences on me, initially I was raised by grandparents until I was about 6 years of age, my father's parents. And his grandmother, my great-grandmother, lived with us. I couldn't pronounce her name, so I called her Muddy. And she was this tiny lady. She was as rotund, she was as wide as she was high, but she was a complete Christian mystic. And particularly she had this extraordinary devotion to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And Mary was more real for Muddy than you, Kate, are to me right now. So I spent a lot of time with her for the first 6 years. So particularly every Christmas there was a life creche, the city churches in St. Paul's, life-size figures. And we'd go down there, she and I would go down every day after Mass when the church was empty, and she talked to Mary. She talked aloud, so I was privy to the conversations. So I remember on one occasion, a local prankster who knew her style went in ahead of us and hid himself in the straw right next to the manger where the baby Jesus was. So we go in, and my great-grandmother kneels down, and she's talking right to Mary. And all of a sudden, this little voice pipes up and says, "Why are you coming? You're always asking for stuff. You're always begging." My great-grandma looks a startled look at the child Jesus, says, "Be quiet, child. I'm talking to your mother." That's how real it was. So that was the first 6 years of my life, that kind of mystical Christianity, side by side with the kind of more orthodox, dogmatic style. And then at age 6, I went back to live with my parents. And now my mother's parents were living there. And I had another grandfather whom I called Daddy Jim. And he was the nearest thing to a druid I've ever come across. So he was a great storyteller. He was a great Irish dancer and a great musician. And so he filled up my life, my head, with all the old Celtic mythology. So there was these two kinds of strands, pre-Christian Celtic mythology mixing with the Christian mysticism. So when I finally get to Africa at age 26, after 8 years in the seminary, it felt like I was back in biblical times or in Celtic Ireland of the time, because the Africa I inherited in 1972, that's what it looked like. So it was like these two streams came together and informed each other in the kind of the oven of Africa, where spirituality is not something to be understood or to be ritualized or kind of dogmatically kind of debated. But everything was alive, a kind of form of animism, where the mountains had a spirit and the rivers had a spirit. And so it's like these three strands came together. And that for me was kind of that was the icing on the cake.
Wonderful. Well, you are certainly an Irish storyteller, Seán. I've enjoyed, learning from you through the stories you tell, and really all three of you have embodied this path that we're talking about today, this path of divine love, this description in our talk is finding God in one another, and the unity that exists in divinity. You've each devoted your lives to this teaching on a very personal level, but also in sharing it with the world. And it's remarkable. And in some ways, when I read each of you, and your books are fabulous. I'd love to just talk about the titles of each of your books, because the titles say a lot. But it almost feels like reading each of what you have written and hearing your homilies and your talks and your poetry and your music. It feels almost like a shortcut. That if I could just memorize your book, then I would be able to grasp all of this. And yet we know there are no shortcuts at all. But you each lead communities. You're each activists in your way, in such a way that is bringing this reality into the world. And so that's where I really want to go now, about how each of us can transcend the patterning of everyday life, unfortunately, of cultural suppression of this truth that each of you has pointed to already. But how can we really begin to transcend these limitations that we have, that you model for us, but that we can't take a shortcut. We have to do it as well. And I think we should mix it up now. I don't need to call upon each of you to talk. Just, it's important to speak really strongly and clearly so that we can hear one another if we start to interweave and talk over one another. But I just want to open up the conversation to all of us, to contributing to, this great gift you've given the world, this gift of your teaching that comes from traditions, but is also very organic in each of you and inspires the same sort of organic exploration for each of us. But who would like to begin? Somebody jump in and talk about how can we transcend human limitations?
So I'll start the ball rolling then, Kate. For me, it's very important to have some kinds of guiding metaphors or analogies that inform the cosmology. So one that makes a lot of sense to me is, if I go down to a shop and I buy a jigsaw puzzle, and I come back and I tear off the cellophane, I open the box, and I throw all the pieces onto the table, I have to make an act of faith that every piece that's there is necessary, and that every piece that's necessary is there. I'm not going to find at the end of the jigsaw puzzle I have 15 pieces left over, or that there's a big gap in the middle of it and I got to go back down and buy some more pieces. And so in some senses, that there are no accidents. The people and the events that we encounter in lifetime are there by what I would call a preconception contract, and that every one of them is necessary, and everything that's necessary in order for me to become an enlightened being is present. But there are some tricks to the trade. I'm going to try the 4 corner pieces that have 2 straight edges. So they might be kind of some guiding principles: compassion, love, forgiveness, lack of prejudice, whatever. And then there are the straight lines that create the outline for it. And that's some kind of a temporary personal belief system that guides my actions, that tells me what is and what is not okay. And then I get 2 more clues. The contours of the pieces and the colors will tell me what goes with what. But the most important piece of all is that I'm looking at the image on the box. And finally, I finish my jigsaw puzzle, the image actually in the box. And the image of the box is the face of God. And therefore, if I'm not creating the face of God in my relationships or in my teaching, I'm putting the pieces in the wrong place, because you can use all the pieces and you can configure them wrongly, and you're not going to get the image you intended, in spite of the fact of using all the pieces. So you can take the events of your life and the relationships of your life, and by misperceiving or misidentifying or misplacing them, you can really mess things up for yourself and for other people. So that would be like a starting image for me.
I love it. That's great. I can relate to that. How about you, Ellen and Will? How do you relate to the pieces of the puzzle?
Well, I think it's true that these different pieces of our lives, each one comes for some purpose. I think in terms of your question about how do we transcend human limitations, I think that for me, the answer that comes is to cultivate a space in the depths of the heart, which mystical practice is intended to do, so that through our prayer and meditation practice, whatever form we have, that it's a daily practice, so that each day begins and ends in a place of communion with the beloved in the depths of the heart. And that takes us out of the world while at the same time we're in the world. So that daily practice creates an inner garden of the soul, I would say, an inner garden that is watered by that practice and gives us a sanctuary deep within, which transcends time, transcends space, and becomes a refuge, but also a refuge that helps us incarnate more fully in the world. So it's not an escape, but it is a relationship to the eternal and the transcendent that then helps us come into the world and take a stand for what is the highest, what we live for. So, for example, in the case of divine love and justice and truth, we live for those principles and we give our lives to those things. And by having that connection to the eternal on a daily basis, it helps us to shed some of the ego attachments and fears and concerns and worries about, not being enough or all of that. that helps us to release all of that and enter the world in a strong place of acting and speaking for and as and in love.
Beautiful. I can quote you back to you, Will, describing this in one of your books. You say that loving devotion is the power by which human beings can transcend their limitations. This it does come back to love, indeed. How about you, Ellen?
Well, I loved the metaphor of the puzzle, and thinking about, how we, when we're putting a puzzle together, we do have a pattern that we're looking for. And of course, our traditions and our practices, I think, give us that kind of support. And I think the times that we're living in really call for I would call it a boldness of spirit. And I think what needs to happen is we have to trust the deepest yearnings of our heart, which is to live a holy life. And in a sense, even we could say to be saints, right? Because we have had this separation, I think, for a long time, that, there are these enlightened ones, there are these saints, and then there are others of us, who muddle along. And we don't have time for that anymore. We just have to remove that separation. And in the yoga tradition, we say that one of the biggest obstacles, and perhaps the biggest obstacle to waking up fully, is thinking that it's not for you, that it's not possible for you, that, there are these saints and sages and, somehow they got it, and you can keep striving and working for it. But that sense that somehow it's not possible for you, and that you have this striving and working and someday maybe, that is just an obstacle. So I think we need this radical role, this radical stance that, here we are divine beings. And now let us live that, let us bring forth that light. And of course, it has a foundation of practice. So we're not just taking off, with our ego self and saying, I am the light and you're not. But we are bringing forth that boldness of living a sacred life every day, and knowing we can do it, and knowing others can as well. And we must do that now together.
I feel your fire, Ellen, and I've quoted you a number of times to myself and also to others, that I've read you say that one of the greatest obstacles in life is the belief that there would be no obstacles. This idea that we're somehow, of course these three are, they're just made that way. When they were little children, they had these mystical experiences, so they're, anointed and appointed, and the rest of us can, sit in front of the TV and and hope for the best, But no, you each lead communities, and you're each activists in the world. But tell me, what are the obstacles? Not that they shouldn't be, not that they should be removed or that we judge them in any way, but for each of you in your work. I know how devoted you are, but what are the things that are challenging you today? And you can share specifically what type of work you're doing for people who don't know, the things that you're passionate about, and let's just go around the table together and jump in.
I'll start off in saying that, in leading a spiritual community, and then over the years, of course, an organization has grown, and now there's a thing. There's a thing that's an organization. And so there's a tension, I think, between the free movement of spirit, expressing, and what you need to do, to maintain an organization. And so, how to stay alive in the spirit of the teachings, how to nurture one another spiritually, how to stay true to your tradition and still grow and thrive, and how to raise funds for the roof on the building. It's the same thing, but just that everybody faces in their daily life, but just I think on a different scale when there's a community life. So that the obstacle, and I don't know that it's an obstacle in the sense that it's really a prod to grow and learn, how do we allow the living vibrancy of spirit, to grow and change, and at the same time maintain the stability that is necessary to nurture a community.
So I'd like to build on that, Ellen. When I look historically at the great teachers, the great avatars, whether it's a Jesus Christ or it's a Buddha figure or a Yogananda figure, what I see is that there's almost an inevitable cycle we have to become aware of, because we're going to visit that cycle at some stage. And it starts off with some kind of an extraordinary charismatic figure who's really, really attractive and has got a great, great message. And then a community of followers, gather around this person and they're really enamored of the teaching. And then at some stage, the teacher dies or is killed. Often a prophetic figure is killed. And now a little oligarchy takes over and it starts creating an institution out of the community. And very, very often, because they're not really up to understanding the teachings of the prophet, they substitute dogma for it, and then they propagate teaching or dogma. And then if they're in a position to do so, they begin inquisiting those within who don't agree with their interpretation, or if they're really strong, they lead crusades against people outside whom they're trying to convert. And at this stage now, we are 180 degrees out from what the founder intended. And at some stage, some new prophetic figure, like St. Francis within Roman Catholicism, comes along and says, that is not what it was about. And you start the whole ball over again. So in a small way, I've seen that in the communities of which I was a part, that you start off with extraordinary enthusiasm, for a purpose and a task, and it's a very spiritual task. But human beings being who we are, egos get in the equation, and at some stage we're getting further and further away from the ideals, and the egos are battling, and we have to call a halt and say, guys, this isn't why the prophet started here, or this wasn't the intention originally. So what do we need to do to get back to the real message? And I think every community is going to experience that, depending on how long they last, once or twice within their lifetime. And I certainly it's been through in my life in Africa and with the companions on the journey.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. I think that is why so often I'm drawn into the silence, because in the silence there is no doctrine, there is no dogma. That's where I go for relief from that. But yeah, in the work that we do, Will, you're out there working for gender reconciliation. You're dealing with environmental devastation, and yet you're also deeply devoted to this a wild abandonment of the heart in the midst of devotion to your tradition, to multiple traditions. But how do you do it, Will?
Well, I really like what Seán was saying, because I've certainly experienced that in my own life, and I've seen that kind of dogma replace inspiration. I think it's very important, for one thing, to reinvent oneself and one's organization. So I also resonated with what Ellen was saying, because I have an organization also, and I see some of those challenges, and I sometimes become part of the problem. And so then I have to be reinvented. And so that's one of the things that I see repeatedly that's happened. But in terms of the obstacles that I face, I would say, actually, one of my, when I first started organizing spiritual retreats for environmentalists, I remember this story, and I did a session with one of the great Roshis, Maizumi Roshi, and we told him we were setting up this organization where we create retreats for environmentalists, and he started laughing uproariously at us. And of course, we laughed with him uncomfortably, thinking, okay, well, I don't know what's quite funny, but he's laughing so hard, so we'll laugh along with him, And then he finally calmed down, and he looked at us and he said, "You are just buffoons." And then we laughed again. We thought, okay, well, that's true, actually. we don't know what we're doing. We're just starting this up. And then finally, he got very serious and he looked at us and he said, you are offering people what they most need. And you will find that almost nobody wants it.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
And what was good about that was that, because I found that in all of my work. So, for example, I noticed a pattern when I was working as a scientist, that the deeper and more profound the work, the less interested most of my colleagues were. And the more shallow and superficial, the more enthused they got. Mm-hmm. And that is kind of the diagnosis of our entire culture. It's catastrophic shallowness. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in the gender reconciliation work that we do, everybody needs it and almost nobody wants it. People do not want to take the journey into the wound. They don't realize that when we do that, we come out the other side liberated, cleansed, and in a new communion with the beloved. That part is a hard sell when you tell them the pathway is through the darkness. We have to go into the darkness to get there. So, and that's similar on the spiritual journey. And so that's one of the challenges I face consistently in our work is that although we've been doing it all over the world and it is growing, it's been a very slow growth compared to the need. And I would say also in the spiritual work and the scientific work that I do, I'm also encountering this constant resistance. It's less so now, but in the last 20, 30 years ago, as a scientist going into spiritual work and then trying to go back to my scientific colleagues, walls of resistance, absolute dismissal, because of this kind of prejudice and dogma that sets in. So those are really challenging obstacles.
I really want to dig into this with you because as you've all taught me, what we see in the world is a reflection of what's happening in the spiritual. And you know that there's I've just started studying fractals and this idea of how science shows us what's happening on multiple levels, and I'm going to defer to Will to talk about fractals, but also the poetic voice as well, the going beyond what words can contain in order to show us the sublime. And I think that the passageway in with each of you and what Will was just talking about, this cultural pushback, the key, as Ellen described, is surrender. And you say it's a hard sell, but let's talk about surrender. And each of you have you're steeped in your traditions, and I'd love for you to share more about your traditions. But how does the idea of surrender break through for all of us?
So I'll pick up on that one, Kate.
Please.
For me, it's been a question of just figuring out to whom I should surrender. And in my case, coming from the Roman Catholic tradition, what I found out was that the vows we took, like celibacy, chastity, and obedience, were literally just submitting an ego to another ego. So for me, surrender is about, in Gaelic we have a phrase, it's féin íshlú. It's like the Islam. It's submitting to God, but not necessarily to an institution. So what I found out is that when an institution hijacks a mystical message and then they demand obedience, it's like they're asking you to turn off your brain. So as a young Catholic boy, it was like I studied math and physics in the university as well. So when I went into a Catholic church and I put my finger in the holy water font and I blessed myself, it was like I was being told, park your brain outside the door and go in here and just do everything you're told. When I went into the halls of academia and studied science and mathematics and physics, I was being told, park your soul outside the door. There's no place here, just as Will is saying. So in the church, you ignore the fact that you have a brain, and in science, you ignore the fact that you have a soul. And you're living, in my case, this kind of a schizophrenic world. And so surrendering to me meant realizing there had to be a higher ideal or a higher truth of which both religion and science were servants. And if I could discover that, I could surrender to that, but I'm not prepared to surrender anymore to orthodoxy or to kind of the scientific, inability to wrestle with the really, really deep mystical questions such as Will is fascinated by. I'm not going to surrender to an institution anymore. I'm not going to just replace my ego with somebody else's equally damaged ego.
Seán, that is so beautiful, and I think it touches on the healing work that we have to do in our communities around the idea of surrender, which is, clearing it up. That false idea that surrender is surrendering to somebody else, or when we have sages in our tradition, we have masters. We also need to clear up the idea that they're a master over somebody else. The idea of being a spiritual master is being a master of yourself.
Yes,
So, with surrender, I think, for me, the way of clearing it up, at least at first in the understanding, is it's simply letting go of the idea that we are separate.
Yes.
That's it.
Yes.
Letting go of that false assumption that we could exist on our own, separate from the source, separate from anyone else. So I usually teach that the back door into surrender is the best way. So instead of trying to figure out how do I do it, how do I surrender, think about the ways in which we insist that we're on our own.
Yes.
And how we insist that life is difficult, that we're not supported. And I find, if we're doing that, that's the back door. You can just go in the door of letting that go, dropping that story about egocentric existence, and taking a good exhale, coming just to be divinely supported and divinely connected.
I love that, Ellen, and I have to quote you. I read someplace you saying, if you can't believe in yourself, believe in God, who is yourself.
Yes.
I love the way you entice people into this reality that is so simple and so true, but it easier said than done for many of us. But in the path of Kriya Yoga, spiritual realization is this direct experience of one's divine self. And Kriya Yoga teaches that very, very clearly as a way of life, as a way of practice in order to, so this is not a distant mystery that you only visit once a week, or somehow not compatible with your intellectual belief. It's very integral and integrated. But each of us, has a different tradition. What Will has done in his book, Belonging to God, is he's shown how incredibly congruent the traditions are. He looks at Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam in a way that, it's a no-brainer to see when Will lays it out, how clearly connected we are. Yet we fail to see that so often. Sometimes that's in our daily life, we get into the ego and we fail to see that. But tell me, each of you, how do you blend your tradition, that devotional path that you so clearly embrace, with the idea that that we really are all one, and that there is unity and community beyond the bounds of tradition? I think some people think you're either in your tradition and devoted to it and have blinders on to everything else, or somehow we would be, as a Christian, I would somehow betray Jesus if I follow Krishna, or that I would somehow, betray the faith of my ancestors if I decide to, study the Baha'i revelation. How do you navigate this with yourselves and with your communities?
I kick it off. At the first World Parliament of Religions was held in Chicago in 1893, and there was a famous debate there between two European theologians, one of whom quoted an English proverb that says, "He knows not England who only England knows." So you have to focus on a particular tradition and really dig down deeply. Otherwise, you're just a kind of a guys that you can't understand any tradition. So I use an example from my own. I live totally off the grid. Where I live up in Northern California, I have my own solar power and my own well, and the well goes down 260 feet. And it's fed by water from the Sierra Mountains. But the area is very geologically diffuse. So as it comes up, it's going through a whole bunch of geological strata. And so there's lead in it, and there's zinc in it, and there's aluminum in it. So I have to do a heavy metal detox before I can drink the water. So for me, it's like the water is spirit. And if you dig down deep enough into the pristine waters, it doesn't matter which well you go down, whether the well is Islam or Christianity, or Buddhism. If you get down deep enough, you're getting the pristine waters. But religions are like these kind of wells that we dig, and the teaching comes up through the stratification that introduce all kinds of toxins into the mix. And so the only way to access the real water is to go down deep enough or compare different wells and find out what do they have in common when you take the toxins out, what remains. And that's the tradition. That's really what we're about, because ultimately I think basically everything that exists is simply God in drag. We're just God in a different guise. And so to pretend like we're different, we're looking at surface differences rather than the deep well water.
Beautiful. Will, jump in, Will, because I've been reading your book and I know what you, it's a big teaching. It's a very big teaching, but what's your experience, Will?
Well, I mean, I would, the metaphors are pretty much identical. I love that metaphor of the well. I think the one I use in my book is about the trees in the forest, and they're all rooted in the same ground, and they all reach to the same hidden waters beneath, and they all stretch to the one light above, the one supreme light above. And, some of the trees are tall and thin, and others are round and full, and some are deciduous and some are evergreens. And so, but they all basically thrive and live by the same spiritual principles, and they all strive for the one light. So, there's so many different ways of looking at it. Like another way is to, in my book, I also look at sort of Einstein with relativity theory, and he started from the premise that the laws of physics should be the same in all reference frames, or they're not laws. They're not really true unless they're true in all reference frames. Well, if you apply that principle to spirituality, the laws of spirituality should be the same in all religious frames. And then the other principle Einstein, which was an observable fact, is that the speed of light is the same in all reference frames. And it's also an observable fact by mystical testimony that divine light functions the same in all religions. And if you get into the testimony of the mystics, light upon light of the Islamic mystics is not different from the experience of the divine light in the Christian and the Buddhist. And so those two principles in physics gave rise to this whole revolution called relativity, and in which the relative local aspects of space and time were revealed to not be absolutes. The absolutes were the laws of physics themselves and the physical speed of light. So applying that in spirituality, the absolutes are the ultimate spiritual truths, and the divine light is universal across all the traditions. And then each tradition is like a refraction of the divine light into a particular color that comes down as a particular color in this world. And so the religions are like simply different colors of the one divine light, and each one is made of light, and each one leads you to the supreme light. So they're all vehicles for the union with the transcendent light of God. And when we see that, and we see the truth of that, and then we see that the mystics, as they speak about their experience, are already speaking about that oneness of that revelation, then we see that all of the religions are different expressions of this exalted truth, and we have got to reclaim that. And that is where the religions meet at that deeper level.
That's a brilliant image, Will.
It's brilliant, and I'm a literary person, so I'm drawn to metaphor. I'm drawn to the stories, and I've always learned a lot in that way, in the poetic voice. I want to hear from Ellen some of her poetry, which has spoken to me on a level that no textbook could do. Only poetry can take me to the sublime. But what Will just said strikes me as not metaphor, it's reality. And this is a breakthrough for me, that I've always seen these as teaching stories, tales that would help me to get to where I need to be. But the deeper I go and the more willing I am to embrace the scientific as well as the poetic, I can see that it's not metaphor, it's reality. And that's mind-blowing. It really is. And yet I need a guide to help me. I need to study in order to do this. But it's also connected with this idea of surrender, that we're Ellen, you're the title of your book of poetry, The Moon Reminded Me. I don't even need to open it at that point. I'm already completely drawn in that my soul knows what the moon is telling me, and it's not new, it's a remembering, is what I take from that. But poetry speaks as poetry speaks. But tell me about how science and poetry and community and solitude come together to break through in a way that metaphor becomes reality.
Well, I'm going to, because I cannot really answer that question, I'm going to offer a poem from The Moon Reminded Me. And this poem is called One Name. Though we call upon you in every language, though the birds and trees and oceans speak your name with every breath, there is only one name for you. It resounds in every sigh, in the breath of lovers, cry of the newborn, rattle of the dying, and the silence that remains. Spoken by every tongue, both eloquent and mute, it gathers us in your wild embrace. I am tempted to say your name is love, but it is not. Or perhaps it is. I cannot say your name, yet I know it sings in our blood, sounding through the universe, whirling in the bright night.
It's beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you. That is beautiful.
What does that speak to you, Will and Seán? I want to hear from the scientists and the mathematicians. I want to hear, because you're both poets as well. We're all poets and scientists and theologians and ditch diggers. We're all these things. But tell me, guys, how this affects you.
For me, I had this theory that the last thing that Mother God whispers to a soul as it's bringing its way into incarnation is it reveals your sacred name, and it reveals your secret mission, that every soul is coming in with a sacred name, and it's not just an identity tag that's going to appear on your driving license, but really it's the sound of the kind of the oscillation of the frequency of your being, your unique contribution, and your mission is attached to that. And so in many traditions, the naming of a child is really, really important. Like there's a tribe in West Africa, and when a woman is about 8 months pregnant, the elders sequester her in a hut, and they put her into a trance, and they speak to the baby in utero, and they believe that the baby will use the mother's voice to respond, and they ask her 2 questions. What is your name? And what is your mission? And as the baby is being born subsequently, the women gather around it, dancing around the baby, the mother-to-be, and they're chanting the name and reminding the baby of what its mission is. So I love Ellen's poem that the name, the sound, the secret, love is the lover's name between source and soul, as they're temporarily kind of disentangled or disconnected during the incarnation. But the connection is always there. And it's the sounds that Ellen so beautifully mentioned, whether it's the death rattle or the cry of a newborn or the wind or the waves or whatever. All of these are just different articulations of source reminding itself of who it really is.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Seán. For me, I resonate with that strongly. And what I would say is that, the nameless name, I mean, what that poem speaks to is the name that can't be named. That's why there's this kind of dilemma. I could call you love. Maybe that's your name. Maybe that isn't, because it's really speaking to a level of transcendence that the name leads us to. So in some of the traditions, it's said that the name is the named. So that basically by invoking the name, you're actually instantiating in consciousness that which transcends the name, but which the name is a microcosmic manifestation of. And that is really the power of mantra, and that is the power of the word, as it's called in Christianity, but really the logos, the sense of logos.
Exactly.
As I understand the name is a manifestation of the logos. The logos is like the sacred principle of consciousness that connects the incarnation to the transcendent. And it's that kind of fractal turning point through which the infinite manifests itself in the depths of the heart. And the name is the kind of vehicle through which that takes place. So but it's a mystery. It's a profound sacred mystery, which is why it can't really be named.
So I love the Aboriginal understanding that everything has a sacred name, and you would never, cross a piece of land or climb a mountain or forge a stream whose name and whose music you didn't understand. So they were shocked when Europeans came and just, like bulls in china chops, just walking all over the place without ever getting to know the land or the mountain's name or its essence. You say, the very beginning of John's Gospel has this great prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, each one of us, our names that we are given in our life is not our true name. That we do actually have a true name somewhere in a spiritual realm, and that name actually reflects our sacred purpose.
Absolutely.
And in some ways, our task in life is to discover the essence of our true name and live that name. And it's not the given name that we have. Actually, there's a beautiful line around name. I'll just tell you, when I was talking with Tenzin Palma, one of our friends, and she was telling us about one of her students who was practicing, the visualization where he was imagining himself to be Chen Rezik. And she said, I have Fred Smith here practicing, and he finally gave up. And she said, why did you give up? And he said, because I'm just Fred Smith pretending to be Chen Rezik. And she laughed uproariously, and she said, no. You are Chen Rezik pretending to be Fred Smith.
I love it. Yeah.
Well, I would love to hear from the poet herself about that poem. How often is it that you read and you actually have the poet in your presence? And if there's anything you can share with us, Ellen, about why you chose that poem and how that poem came to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity to share it. And thank you, Kate and Seán and Will, for listening so deeply to it. And, you have all touched it so brilliantly. It really was an attempt to speak about what cannot be spoken about, and also to put my finger on this tendency that we have to want to put the unbounded infinite into some kind of a box. And so we say it's love, God is love. Well, what does that mean? So we say its name is love, and so I wanted to say, even that we cannot say.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, we can say.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that dance, between the eminent and the transcendent, I'll say, that dance that goes on and goes on. And, and that's a question that comes up, I think, on the mystical path, right? After you realize it is all one, after you become a Vedantin, which I think, that's where mysticism takes us. How do you continue to have this bhakti relationship with the other once you realize there is no other? And so, Will, that's right in your territory. So tell us that, once you get it, how do you continue to play?
Well, I would invoke maybe Ramakrishna, who speaks about the whole dance between tasting the nectar and becoming the nectar. And when you merge into the beloved, then you become the sweetness that you were so drawn to. And so that has a whole kind of quality of mergence, but then you're drawn to separate again ever so slightly in order to taste that sweetness again. So there's a kind of dance back and forth between duality and mergence. And I think that that's part of the human condition. I mean, when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he moved into duality when he said, you know, Father, Abba, if it's possible, take this cup from my lips. So that's his humanity in duality, experiencing God as something separate and asking God. And then, of course, he says, you know, not my will, but thy will. So there's that mergence back in. And I think human existence is a constant dance between the experience of a separate self, but a distinct being, but not separate. I think that's what it is. We're distinct, but not separate. And actually, you know, Ibn Arabi speaks very powerfully about how God cannot even know the fullness of God unless God enters into a lover-beloved relationship that requires a duality. So if it's all mergence and only ever mergence, and there's only that one merged God, then we have the dilemma of, as it said in Islam, I was a hidden treasure and longed to be known, hence I created the world. So the world was created for God to know God in some sense. And there's ways in which God can only know God through that duality of lover and beloved. There's an aspect of divinity that can only be known in that duality. But what happens is that in that intense love between lover and beloved, that duality merges into oneness. And so I think it goes back and forth. That's kind of my understanding of it.
Brilliant. Yeah.
This is what I meant by how agile these great teachers are in these. You remind me of those images of photographs taken in the early 20th century of those iron workers who would walk across the beams, building skyscrapers, and they just walked like they were walking down the street. They're eating their lunch up there, 1,000 feet above the ground. That's what I see when you three come together and talk. You are able to walk what for so many of us seems so high, as if you're right on the ground. And I think the truth is we are all grounded. And the more grounded we are, the more agile we become in these sublime conversations. You've given me a tremendous gift today, and I look forward to sharing this gift with everyone who's out there listening. This description of love or not love. I've heard Will say love is a fire.
Beautiful.
We could go on with that. I've heard Seán talk about how God is not a person. God is love unlimited. Mm-hmm. This wild abandon, this path of devotion that you blaze for us, deeply steeped in tradition, but also what I'm seeing today is organic teaching coming. This is rare. It's very rare for me to bring together people that have such depth, that what comes out of your mouth is so pure. And I just want to thank each of you for this time together, and appreciate the gift of your work and the gift of your being to this world.
Well, thank you, Kate. I just want to say that what comes out of your mouth is also beautiful. And I feel a little humbled by you putting us on a kind of a pedestal, because what we're speaking about is accessible to every human soul. It's a matter of simply moving into the depths of your heart and living from your own authenticity. That's all that's required, and that's all that we're doing.
Indeed. And of course, humility is one of your traits that allows you to do this. I think the awe that we experience is the awe of the divine, and the divine in you, the divine in me, this path of wild abandon that we're talking about, this unity in divinity that we experience, it just strikes awe. And so forgive me for putting you on that pedestal. I just wanted to bring that out, because
this is the great glory of human existence, and we're all called to live this. You know, Jesus said so beautifully, I am the light of the world. You are the light of the world. You are identical to me. So discover that Christ within, discover that Buddha within. You know, that beautiful line from Thomas Keating, where he says the entire purpose of Christianity is transformation into Christ, nothing else. The entire purpose of Buddhism is transformation into Buddha, nothing else. The good news is that each one of us is Christ and Buddha and Krishna. That's who we are. So let's discover and live from the truth of who we are. And we are each that incredible, magnificent glory manifest here on earth.
Brilliant. Well said, Will.
Very, very brilliant and very wonderful. Thank you all. This is exactly
Thank you, Kate.
What I had hoped to emerge from each of you is these gems of wisdom and delivered on the words of love from each of you. So thank you again. Look forward to our next gathering. This has been a wonderful time. I'm Kate Sheehan Roach with On Air. Thank you to Sacred Stories Media. Visit us at sacredsstoriesmedia.com, and you'll see the wonderful websites of each of these three great teachers where you can learn more. This is just the tip of the iceberg, and I welcome comments and conversation about this wonderful conversation. Blessings to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you so much.